When kingship came down from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. That is the first line of a list. The list is cut in Sumerian into the four sides of a clay prism about 8 inches tall, and the prism has a hole bored straight through the middle of it, top to bottom. The hole was for a spindle. Somebody meant this object to be turned. Picture that for a moment before anything else. Not a book, not a scroll. A short clay column, the color of weak tea, standing on a wooden pin, and a hand reaching out in a room somewhere in southern Iraq. Nearly 4,000 years ago, to give it a quarter turn, so the next column of writing came round into the light. The prism sits now in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, catalogued as the Weld-Blundell prism. It came into the museum's collection in the early 1920s, purchased through the antiquities dealer network by the traveler and benefactor Herbert Weld-Blundell, and it is the fullest surviving copy of what scholars call the Sumerian King List. The list names kings. It gives their cities and the lengths of their reigns, and it begins in a world before a flood, with rulers whose reigns are counted in tens of thousands of years, and it works its way forward through the deluge into names that historians can pin to real dynasties and real datable events. Somewhere in the middle of it, the world changes. The list has a hinge in it. On one side of the hinge is a world that ended. On the other side is the world the writer lived in. Hold on to that hand on the spindle. We will come back to it at the end of the night, and when we do, it will not be to surprise you. It will be to come home, because the Bible has a list like that too. It is the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis, and it is the subject of this long, quiet walk we are about to take together. The world before the flood, and the world that came out of it, and the ground under both of them. There is a particular difficulty with these 11 chapters, and it is worth naming gently at the start. They are the most familiar pages in the Bible. If you were raised in a church, you heard them before you could read. Garden, snake, 2 brothers, big boat, tall tower, felt board, flannel graph, a paper rainbow taped above a paper ark, an animal cracker in each hand. And so the strange thing about Genesis 1 to 11 is that most of us have never actually been taken into them. We were given the shape of them at 5 years old, and then we grew up, and the shape stayed the size it was. Tonight, we are going to go under them, under the story, into the world the story is set in, and the world it was written down in, the cities, the rivers, the brick, the tablets in the ground, the men and women who dug them up, and the arguments they had afterward. None of this is going to be a demolition. I want to say that plainly, because there is a whole genre of talk about Genesis that treats every new discovery as an unmasking, and that is not what we are doing here, and I do not find it honest. What we are going to do is set 3 things side by side and let them stand there together. What the text says, what the ground has produced, what the tradition has held. Where those 3 agree, I will say so. Where they pull apart, I will say that too. And I am not going to pretend to settle it for you at 1 in the morning. You do not need a verdict tonight. You need a long, careful, unhurried walk through a very old country. So let us go back to a room in London on the 3rd of December, 1872. The room belonged to the Society of Biblical Archaeology, which had been founded only 2 years before. The audience included the Prime Minister, William Gladstone, and the man at the front was a former banknote engraver named George Smith, 32 years old, largely self-taught, who had spent his lunch hours as a young man standing in front of the Assyrian galleries of the British Museum until somebody noticed how good he had become at reading what was in the cases. Smith worked in the museum as a repairer. His job was to sit with trays of broken clay from the mounds of northern Iraq and fit the pieces back together. They were the tablets excavated by Austin Henry Layard and Hormuzd Rassam in the 1840s and 50s from the ruins of Nineveh, from the library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, who reigned in the 7th century before Christ, and who had made it his ambition to collect every text in the world. Ashurbanipal's palace burned. That is why we have the library. Fire destroys papyrus and parchment, and it bakes clay hard. Smith found a fragment. He cleaned the deposit off it. And what came up under the crust was an account of a great flood. A man told to build a boat, a flood sent by the gods, the boat grounding on a mountain, birds sent out to test the water. The paper he read that December evening was called The Chaldean Account of the Deluge, and it went around the world in a week. What Smith had found is what we now call the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Daily Telegraph, seeing a story, paid for him to go to Nineveh and look for the missing pieces. And in May of 1873, on his 5th day of digging, he found a fragment that filled one of the largest gaps. He was dead 3 years later, at 36, of illness on his 3rd expedition near Aleppo. He had done more in 9 years than most scholars manage in 50. I want you to notice something about that 1872 evening, because it sets the tone for everything that follows. The tablet was older than the Bible, not older than the events, older than any manuscript. Ashurbanipal's copy dates to the 7th century before Christ, and the story it copies is far older still, with versions running back 1,000 years before that. And the reaction in 1872 was not what people now assume. Some were shaken, many were delighted. To a great many Victorian believers, an independent ancient witness to a great flood looked like confirmation, not contradiction. And Smith's popular book of 1876 carried the title, The Chaldean Account of Genesis, and sold enormously. That instinct, that the older material illuminates rather than erases, is closer to the historical mood of the last 150 years than the louder framings you may have heard. Because here is what actually happened over the century and a half since. The flood tablet was only the first of them. In 1914, a German Assyriologist named Arno Poebel, working through the Nippur tablets at the University of Pennsylvania, published a small, badly damaged Sumerian tablet that told a flood story older in language than either Gilgamesh or the Bible, with a hero named Ziusudra. Thorkild Jacobson would name that text the Eridu Genesis in an article in 1981. In 1965, and again in 1969, Wilfrid Lambert and Alan Millard published the Atrahasis epic in something close to its full extent, working from an old Babylonian copy written out by a scribe named Ipik-Aya in the reign of Ammisaduqa of Babylon, in the middle of the 17th century before Christ. Think about that name for a second. Ipik-Aya, a working scribe. We have his name because he signed his tablets the way a mason signs a stone where nobody will look. And in 1985, a man named Douglas Simmons walked into the British Museum with a bag of antiquities his father had picked up in the Near East around the end of the Second World War. And one of them was a clay tablet the size of a mobile phone with 60 lines of old Babylonian cuneiform on it. The curator who looked at it was Irving Finkel. Simmons took the tablet home again. Finkel waited 14 years, ran into him at an exhibition, asked outright, and finally got to read it properly. It gave instructions for building the boat: rope, ribs, bitumen, quantities. And the boat was round. We will come back to that boat. So this is the shape of the night. We are going to walk down through Genesis 1 to 11 in order, one movement at a time, the way you would walk down a long staircase in the dark with a hand on the rail. No hurry, and each step taken before the next. And at each step, we will stop and look sideways at the world around it, the cities, the rivers, the clay, the people who wrote and the people who dug. I should tell you how I am going to handle the hard places so that nothing catches you unprepared. When something is a matter of documented record, a tablet with a museum number, an excavation with a report, a date fixed by stratigraphy, I will say so, and I will name the person and the year where I can. When something is scholarly interpretation, a reading, an argument, a reconstruction, a theory that competent people disagree about, I will label it as interpretation, and I will try to give you the shape of the disagreement rather than only the side I lean toward. And when something is faith tradition, what the church has held, what the rabbis taught, what has been believed and prayed and sung for 2,000 years and more, I will name it as tradition, and I will treat it with the seriousness it has earned. I am not going to mock any of the three. I do not think any of them is a joke. And I am not going to pretend that a disagreement between them is a scandal, because after 25 years of reading in this field, I have come to think that the disagreements are mostly the ordinary friction of very old things rubbing against each other, and not a plot. One last thing before we begin, about the land itself, because the geography does a lot of quiet work in these chapters. Genesis 1-11 is not set in Israel. That is the first surprise for a reader who comes to it expecting the Holy Land. The garden is watered by 4 rivers, 2 of which are named as the Tigris and the Euphrates. The ark comes to rest on the mountains of Ararat, which is the north. The tower is built in a plain in the land of Shinar, which is the south. Abram's family sets out from Ur of the Chaldees, which is the deep south, near the head of the Persian Gulf. The whole of the primeval history takes place in and around Mesopotamia, the land between the 2 rivers, modern Iraq and its edges, and it only turns west toward Canaan in the last few verses of chapter 11. That is a plain who, what, where fact about the text, and it is worth sitting with. These chapters are set in the world of the clay tablets. They share their address. So picture the address. 2 rivers running southeast off the mountains of eastern Turkey, through Syria and Iraq, converging near the Gulf. Between and around them, in the lower stretch, a great flat alluvial plain built out of the silt the rivers themselves have carried down for 100,000 years. No stone worth the name, no timber worth the name, no metal ore at all. What the plain has instead is water, mud, reeds, date palms, barley, fish, and bitumen seeping up out of the ground in black pools. And out of exactly those materials, in the 6th and 5th millennia before Christ, people in the south of that plain built the first cities on earth. Everything in Genesis 1-11 that seems odd to a modern reader becomes ordinary in that landscape. Why is the tower built of brick and not stone? Because there is no stone. Why is the ark sealed with pitch? Because bitumen comes out of the ground there for free. Why does a story about the end of the world take the form of water? Because in southern Mesopotamia, the end of the world is water. It always was. It is a floodplain. The rivers change course. The Gulf rises and falls. The spring melt comes down off the Anatolian snowfields all at once, and a town that has stood for 200 years can be a smear of dissolved mud brick in a single season. We will come to what the archaeology actually shows about that, and I will be careful with it, because it is one of the places where the popular account and the excavation reports have drifted a long way apart. But first, the beginning, the first sentence, and the sky. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. 7 words in the Hebrew, 10 in the King James. And then the second verse, which is where the strangeness starts. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. 3. Hebrew expressions in that verse are worth taking slowly because each of them opens a door. The first is tohu wabohu, rendered in the King James as without form and void. It is a rhyming pair, and the rhyme is doing part of the work, the way helter-skelter or hodgepodge does in English. Tohu on its own means waste, emptiness, trackless desert. Bohu is rarer, and appears almost only alongside it. The sense is not nothing. It is closer to an unusable place, a wilderness, somewhere with no shape you could live in. The second is Tehom, the deep. And here we step straight into the wider world, because Tehom is the Hebrew cousin of the Akkadian word Tiamtu, meaning the sea, the same root that gives the name Tiamat, who in the Babylonian creation epic is the saltwater ocean personified as a goddess. This is a linguistic fact of the ordinary kind, the sort of thing that connects English father to German Vater. Hebrew and Akkadian are both Semitic languages. Words are shared. The relationship between Tehom and Tiamtu is not a secret and not a scandal. It is philology. What is interesting is what Hebrew does with the word. In the Bible, Tehom appears about 36 times, and in every one of them it is water. It is never a person. It never speaks, never fights, never has a body to be cut in half. The Babylonian epic in question is the Enuma Elish, named from its opening words, when on high. It was recovered in fragmentary form by Layard from Nineveh in 1849 and published by George Smith in the 1870s. It runs to about 1,000 lines on 7 tablets. It was recited at the Akitu festival, the Babylonian New Year, before the statue of Marduk. In it, the young god Marduk fights Tiamat, kills her, splits her body, and makes the sky out of one half of her, setting a bar and posting a guard so that her waters cannot escape. Set that beside Genesis 1, and you can hear both the family resemblance and the deliberate difference. In one, the sky is made from the corpse of a defeated enemy. In the other, God says, "Let there be a firmament," and there is a firmament, and nobody dies. The third word is that firmament, rakia. It comes from a verb, raka, which means to hammer or beat something out thin, the word used elsewhere for hammering metal into sheets. The lexicon of Brown, Driver, and Briggs glosses it as an extended surface, a solid expanse, as if beaten out. The Latin Vulgate rendered it firmamentum, from firmare, to make firm. That is where the King James firmament comes from, and the German scholar Gerhard von Rad, writing in the middle of the 20th century, thought the Vulgate had it right. So what did an ancient reader picture when the text said, "God made a firmament and divided the waters above it from the waters below"? Almost certainly something like a dome, a hammered vault over the flat disk of the land, with water above it and water below it, and the visible sky as its underside. Now, I want to slow down here, because this is exactly the sort of detail that gets used as ammunition in a fight I have no interest in. The point is not that the Bible is wrong about meteorology. The point is that the Bible is written in the language and the picture world of the people it was given to, which is what any communication has to do. The English word sunrise is not a claim about celestial mechanics. It is a word for what you see from where you stand. The rakia is the sky as it looks from the roof of a mud brick house in the 4th or the 8th century before Christ, which is to say, solid, blue, holding something back. And what Genesis does with that shared picture is the interesting part. It takes the standard furniture of ancient Near Eastern cosmology, deep, dome, waters above, and it empties it of gods. Which brings me to the first place tonight, where I will tell you what I actually think. The reading I find most persuasive of Genesis 1 is that its quietness is the argument. Look at the 4th day. And God made 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. The sun is not named. The moon is not named. In Hebrew, the ordinary words for sun and moon are Shemesh and Yarich, and both of them are also the names of deities worshipped across the ancient Near East. Shamash was the sun god of Mesopotamia, the god of justice, whose image sits at the top of the great law stele of Hammurabi. Genesis will not use the words. It says the greater light and the lesser light, the way you might refer to a former colleague by their job title. And then it says, "He made the stars also." 4 words in English, 3 in Hebrew, dropped in at the end of a sentence like an afterthought. The stars. The whole apparatus of Babylonian astronomy and astrology, the omen literature, the enormous serious science of celestial divination that Mesopotamian scholars practiced for 2,000 years and that made Babylon a byword for star reading down into the Roman period. He made the stars also. I do not think that is carelessness. I think it is one of the driest, most confident sentences in ancient literature. And I think a hearer in the 7th or 6th century before Christ, who knew perfectly well what the Babylonians thought the stars were, would have felt the floor tilt slightly under him when he heard it. That is an interpretation. Other readers hear it differently, and there is a long, careful literature arguing that Genesis 1 is primarily liturgical, or primarily a temple text, or primarily concerned with function rather than material origin. I hold my reading lightly, but I hold it. Now, the days. You may have been told that reading the 6 days as something other than 6 periods of 24 hours is a modern accommodation, a nervous concession made after Darwin. That is not what the historical record shows, and I want to lay the record out plainly, because it belongs to all of us. Origen of Alexandria, writing in the first half of the 3rd century, pointed out that the first 3 days pass before the sun exists, and asked what a solar day could mean without a sun. He read the chapter heavily, allegorically. Basil of Caesarea, one of the great Cappadocian fathers, preached 9 homilies on the 6 days, the Hexameron, apparently during a single Lenten week in the year 378, the year he died. Basil pushed back hard against the allegorists. When he heard grass, he said, he thought of grass. Augustine of Hippo, writing his long commentary called The Literal Meaning of Genesis in the early 5th century, went in a third direction entirely. He noticed that the text says one day, not the first day, and concluded that creation was in some sense instantaneous, with the days as a framework of exposition rather than a sequence of mornings. Origen, Basil, Augustine, 3rd century, 4th century, 5th century, 3 of the most serious minds the Church ever produced, reading the same chapter, reaching 3 different accounts of what its days are. They were not doing this under pressure from geologists. There were no geologists. They were doing it because the chapter itself raises the question, and always has. I find that enormously steadying, and I offer it to you as such. If you have ever felt that you were the first person in the pew to wonder about the sun on day 4, you were about 1,700 years late to that particular thought, and in very good company. So what is the chapter actually shaped like? Look at it as a piece of architecture rather than a report, and something clicks into place. Days 1, 2, and 3 make 3 empty places, light and dark, sky and sea, dry land. Days 4, 5, and 6 fill them, in order. Sun and moon and stars for the light and dark, birds and fish for the sky and sea, animals and humanity for the dry land. 3 habitats, then 3 sets of tenants. The problem in verse 2 was tohu wabohu, a place with no shape and nobody in it. The 6 days are the answer to exactly that problem, in exactly that order. First shape, then inhabitants. That structure was noticed long before modern scholarship, and it is one of those observations that survives whatever else you conclude. It is simply how the chapter is built. And then the 7th day, which is the strangest of all, and the one we most reliably skip. There is no evening and morning on the 7th day. The formula that has closed each of the previous 6 simply stops. The day does not end. In the Mesopotamian creation accounts, humanity is made because the gods are tired. That is stated flatly in Atrahasis. The lesser gods have been digging the irrigation canals. They mutiny, and humanity is made from clay and the blood of a slain god so that somebody else can carry the baskets. Work is the reason for our existence in that account. We are the labor force. In Genesis, the labor ends and the rest begins, and the human beings are made on the sixth day, before it, so that the first full day they experience is the day of rest. I am not going to preach that. I said at the start that I would not, and I meant it, and it is well past midnight. But you should know it is there, because it is the sort of detail that gets flattened out of the children's version, and it is the hinge on which the whole chapter turns. One more thing about Genesis 1 before we go down into the garden. There is an old rabbinic reflection on why the human race begins with one man rather than many, and it is preserved in the Mishnah, the earliest layer of rabbinic law, compiled in the land of Israel around the year 200. It comes in a strange place. Tractate Sanhedrin, in the 4th chapter, is discussing court procedure, specifically, what a judge should say to witnesses in a capital case to impress on them the weight of what they are about to do. And the answer the Mishnah gives is this: Adam was created alone, so that whoever destroys a single life is regarded as having destroyed a whole world, and whoever saves a single life is regarded as having saved a whole world. And, it goes on, humanity began from one man for the sake of peace among people, so that nobody could say to his neighbor, "My father was greater than yours." And this: a man strikes many coins from one die, and they all come out identical. But the Holy One made every person from the die of Adam, and not one of them is the same as another. That is faith tradition, clearly labeled. It is not archaeology, and it is not exegesis in the modern sense. It is a rabbinic reading roughly 1,800 years old, given to frightened witnesses in a courtroom to make their hands shake before they spoke. And it is, I think, the best short summary anybody has ever written of what Genesis 1 does to the value of a human being. One die, no two the same, every one of them a world. Hold that as we go down into the 2nd chapter, because the 2nd chapter is where the camera comes down out of the sky and lands in the mud. And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And man became a living soul. In Hebrew, there is a pun in that sentence that no English translation has ever really managed. The word for the man is Adam. The word for the ground is Adamah. They are the same root, and the 2nd chapter of Genesis leans on the pairing again and again, all the way to the sentence at the end of the 3rd chapter. Dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return. The closest English can get is the relationship between human and humus, the word for soil, or between earthling and earth. Neither is comfortable, which is why translators have generally let the pun go. And note that in the Hebrew of these chapters, Adam is usually not a name at all. It carries the definite article, ha-Adam, the human, the man. The proper name emerges gradually out of the common noun, which is itself a small piece of craftsmanship. So the first thing the 2nd chapter tells us about a human being is that he is soil with breath in him, and that he is named after the field. Where is the field? And a river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from thence it was parted, and became into 4 heads. The text then names them: Pison, which compasses the land of Havilah, where there is gold; Gihon, which compasses the land of Cush; Hiddekel, which goes toward the east of Assyria; and Euphrates. 2 of those 4 we know for certain. Hiddekel is the Tigris, the Akkadian name is Idiglat, and the correspondence is exact. Perath is the Euphrates. Both rivers still run, and they run through the country we have been talking about all night. Pison and Gihon are the puzzle, and they have been the puzzle for a very long time. Ancient readers, casting about for great rivers, guessed the Nile and the Ganges. Josephus, writing at the end of the 1st century after Christ, took that view. The modern discussion has been more interesting and more local. In the 1980s, the archaeologist Juris Zarins proposed that the garden's location should be sought at the head of the Persian Gulf, in territory now underwater. His case rested on two pieces of evidence. The first was climate and sea level. At the end of the last glacial period, the Gulf was largely dry land, a river valley rather than a sea, and it filled as the oceans rose. Anything at its head is now under the water. The second was satellite imagery. Photographs revealed the beds of large rivers that no longer flow, fossil channels running out of central and northern Arabia toward the Gulf. The most discussed of these is the Wadi al-Batin, running from western Saudi Arabia toward Kuwait, and the biblical archaeologist James Sauer argued in print that this dry system was a strong candidate for the Pison, which the text associates with Havilah and its gold. For the Gihon, Zarin suggested the Karun, which rises in Iran and comes down into the same general area at the head of the Gulf, and he connected the biblical Kush not with Africa, but with the Kassites of western Iran. That is a real argument by a real archaeologist, and it is worth knowing. It is also contested, and I want to give you the objection fairly, because it is a good one. Joel Baden of Yale has pointed out that the text describes a single river going out of Eden and dividing into four, whereas the model has four rivers converging on one place. Those are not the same geography. They are, in a sense, opposite geographies, and no marine archaeology has yet supported the identification. The Gulf floor is not an easy place to excavate, and until somebody does the survey, this remains a hypothesis with satellite photographs attached to it. So where does that leave us? Honestly, where it leaves most careful readers. Two of the four rivers are certain, and they place the garden's imagined world in Mesopotamia. The other two are unresolved, and I am not going to resolve them for you tonight. But there is something else the text gives us about the garden that we can follow into the ground, and it is the more interesting road anyway. Eden is a garden with a river in it, and the river makes it fertile. And there is a settlement tradition in exactly that country of a first place, a first city, associated with fresh water coming up from below. The city is Eridu. If you take a road southwest out of Nasiriyah in southern Iraq today, out past the last of the irrigated ground, you come to a shallow depression in the desert with a low mound in the middle of it. The Arabic name is Tel Abu Shahrain. It was identified as Eridu in 1855 by a British archaeologist named John George Taylor, who found bricks with the name on them. Eridu is the city where the Sumerian King List says kingship first came down. It is the first name on the prism, and when it was finally dug properly, it turned out to be one of the oldest continuously occupied places on the planet. The major excavation ran from 1946 to 1949, directed by the Iraqi archaeologist Fuad Safar with the British archaeologist Seton Lloyd, working for the Iraqi Directorate General of Antiquities. Their full report did not appear until 1981, which is one of the small tragedies of the field. They cut down into the main mound and found 18 successive building levels. Under a half-built ziggurat of the 3rd dynasty of from around 2100 before Christ, was temple beneath temple beneath temple, each raised on the ruins of the last, going back to the middle of the 6th millennium before Christ. The earliest was a single room, a small mud brick chamber with an altar and an offering table, something like 12 feet by 15. And on that spot, for the next 4,000 years, people kept building the same building. The god of Eridu was Enki, lord of the fresh water under the earth, of the Abzu, the sweet water that comes up in wells and springs in a land otherwise surrounded by salt. The temple was called the Abzu, the house of the deep. I find that stack of 18 floors as moving as anything in Mesopotamian archaeology. Not because it proves anything about Genesis. It does not, and anybody who tells you it does is selling something, but because of what it is in itself. A place where fresh water came up, a room built over it, and then, when the room fell down, another room, in the same place, by people who remembered. Seton Lloyd left one detail in his memoirs that I have never been able to forget. There was no building material at the site to make a dig house from, so he and Safar drove 10 miles over to Ur and helped themselves to the bricks of Leonard Woolley's abandoned expedition house. Many of them ancient bricks stamped with royal names, perfectly intact. Archaeologists sleeping in a hut made of Ur. Now let me put you inside that landscape properly, because the texture of it matters more for the rest of the night than any argument I could make. It is late afternoon in the 5th millennium before Christ, in a village on the edge of the southern marshes, and the light is going long and gold across standing water. The houses are of two kinds. Some are mud brick, clay from the riverbank, chopped straw mixed in to bind it, pressed into a wooden mold and turned out to bake in the sun. The finished bricks loaf-shaped and slightly convex, laid up into walls 2 or 3 courses thick and plastered over. The rest are reed. Where the marsh runs close, people cut the tall reeds, bind them into tight bundles, set the bundles in holes dug in the ground, then bend opposing pairs together and lash them at the top into an arch. Reed mats over the frame make the roof. Another mat hung makes the door. Inside there is very little. A chest, mats on the beaten floor, storage jars sunk at the base of a wall, grain in one, sesame oil in another, beer in a third. At the back, or in a corner of the yard where the wind can take the smoke, stands the tanner, a cylindrical clay oven, sometimes set down into the floor, sometimes raised to waist height. The dough is barley, coarse and gray, slapped in flat rounds against the hot inner wall of the oven, where it sticks and puffs and blisters. There is a smell to that oven that has not changed in 7,000 years. And if you have ever stood next to a tandoor in a city street at night, you already know it. Wood smoke, scorched flour, and under it the sourness of yesterday's dough left to work. Outside, the sounds are water sounds, reeds moving, a duck getting up off the channel. Somewhere, a woman's voice, and the flat knock of a paddle against the side of a boat. The boat itself is worth a moment. Among the objects Safar and Lloyd pulled out of the Ubaid levels at Eridu was a small terracotta model of a boat, with a socket amidships for a mast and holes along the sides for stays. A toy, or a votive offering, or an offcut from a potter's afternoon. Somebody's small clay boat, 5,500 years old, and it has a mast hole in it, which means that there were sails on that water before there was writing anywhere in the world. The evening meal is barley bread and a stew of vegetables, onion sharp, with fish in it if the day went well. Beer to drink, thick, unfiltered, closer to porridge than to anything you would order now, and drunk through a reed straw to get past the husks floating on top. Then the light goes. The roof is flat on the brick houses, and in hot weather the family carries the mats up and sleeps on it, under the whole enormous sky of a country with no hills and no lights. That is the world. Not primitive, specific, not simple, small and skilled and entirely dependent on 2 rivers behaving themselves. Every one of those people knew, in the way you know the weather where you live, that the water could come. And now go back to the garden and read what the man is put there to do. The King James says to dress it and to keep it. The Hebrew verbs are avad and shamar, to work and to guard or watch over. Avad is the ordinary word for agricultural labor. It is also the word for serving, including serving God. Shamar is the word a watchman does at night. So the first job description given to a human being in the Bible is, work this and stand watch over it. Not own it, not conquer it, work it and keep watch. That is a translation note, not a sermon, and I will leave it exactly where it is. But it is the note the 3rd chapter is about to play against. The 3rd chapter is the shortest of the great chapters, and the one carrying the most weight. and I am going to walk through it slowly and without raising my voice. The serpent is introduced with a wordplay. He is Aram, subtle, shrewd, clever. And the last word of the previous chapter described the man and his wife as Aramim, naked. Same consonants, different word. Hebrew narrative does this constantly, and it is one of the reasons the text rewards being read aloud. What the serpent does is not, in the first instance, tempt. He asks a question, and the question misquotes. Yea, hath God said, Ye shall not eat of every tree of the garden? That is not what was said. The permission was broad and the restriction was narrow, and the question inverts the proportions. And the woman, answering, adds something that was not in the command either. Neither shall ye touch it. Two small distortions, one in each direction, before anything is picked. I point that out because it is easy to miss under the weight of everything the chapter has been made to carry, and because it is a genuinely observant piece of writing about how a thing goes wrong. Nobody in the scene starts by deciding to rebel. The command gets restated slightly badly, twice, and then it is not the same command anymore. What follows is the part that lands on the ground. Cursed is the ground for thy sake. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. Thorns also and thistles shall it bring forth to thee. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return unto the ground. Notice where the curse actually falls. Not on the man, on the Adama, on the soil he was named after, and the consequence is stated in terms of agricultural labor. Thorns, thistles, sweat, bread. Here is where the archaeology of the whole region says something quietly relevant, and I want to be careful about how I put it, because this is interpretation and not proof. For most of the human past, people in the Near East lived by hunting, gathering, and following animals. Beginning around 10,000 years before Christ, in the arc of hill country running from the Levant up through southeastern Turkey and down the Zagros, they began to farm. The skeletal record of that transition is not a story of improvement. Compared with the foragers who preceded them, early farming populations across the region tend to show shorter stature, more dental disease, more evidence of anemia and of periodic malnutrition, and, in the joints and vertebrae, the signatures of heavy repetitive labor. Farming produced more calories per acre and supported far more people. It did not, at first, produce healthier or easier lives. It produced grain, surplus, storage, property, and back pain. Genesis 3 is not a description of that transition. I want to be clear. It is a theological account of the human condition, written by people who were themselves farmers, and the connection I am drawing is a resonance and not an identification. But the resonance is there, and I have never quite been able to unhear it. The chapter says that the day came when human beings began to get their bread out of the ground by sweat, with thorns in the field, and that something had gone wrong to bring that about. Whatever else that is, it is not a naive account of agriculture. It is a strikingly unsentimental one. And then the fourth chapter, where the two ways of living meet. Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground, the shepherd and the farmer. That pairing is one of the great standing subjects of Sumerian literature, and it long predates Genesis. There is a whole genre of Sumerian composition that scholars call disputation poems, in which two figures argue about which of them is more valuable, and a god decides. Summer disputes with winter, the bird disputes with the fish, the pickaxe disputes with the plow. One of these concerns Dumuzi, the shepherd, and Enkimdu, the farmer, who are rivals for the goddess Inanna. The two of them argue their cases at length. Dumuzi lists everything he can give her: milk, cheese, butter, wool. And the ending is the interesting part, because it is nothing like Genesis 4. The two of them come to terms. Enkimdu backs down and offers Dumuzi his pasture. Dumuzi invites Enkimdu to the wedding. The poem finishes in friendship. That is the standard ancient shape. The shepherd and farmer tension gets aired, and then resolved into cooperation, because in an irrigated floodplain, the herders and the growers actually did need each other, and everybody knew it. Genesis takes the same pairing and refuses the resolution. One brother kills the other. Now, why was one offering accepted and not the other? This is one of the oldest questions in the book, and the text is famously reticent about it. Cain brings of the fruit of the ground. Abel brings of the firstlings of his flock, and of the fat thereof. Some readers point to that word firstlings and to the fat, and argue the difference is in the quality. Abel brings the best and the first, and Cain brings, simply, some. Others locate the difference not in the gift, but in the giver. Since the text says, "The Lord had respect unto Abel and to his offering," the person first, then the gift. Others say the chapter deliberately declines to explain, and that its subject is not the reason, but the response. I lean toward the last, and I will say why, because this is the second place tonight where I owe you my own view. The reading I find most persuasive is that Genesis 4 is not interested in the mechanics of the offering at all, and that the whole moral weight of the chapter falls on the sentence God says next. If thou doest well, shalt thou not be accepted? And if thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door. That is not a verdict. That is a door left open. God speaks to Cain after the rejection, before the murder, and what he offers him is a way back and a warning in the same breath. The word translated lieth is ravets, a verb used of an animal crouching. Sin is pictured as something couched at the threshold, waiting. And there is an old and much discussed suggestion that the image draws on the Akkadian Rabisu, a kind of demon that lurks in doorways in Mesopotamian incantation texts, a suggestion I would file under plausible, contested, and not necessary to the sense. The point stands either way. Something is crouching at your door, and you are told about it, and you are told you may rule it. And then Cain goes out to the field anyway, and the first death in the Bible is a brother's. Am I my brother's keeper? That is the oldest bad answer in the world, and it is worth hearing what is inside it in Hebrew. The word for keeper is shomer, from shamar, the same verb given to the man in the garden. To guard, to watch over. He was asked to keep a garden. He asks whether he is required to keep a brother. The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground. Blood, in the Hebrew, is plural, bloods. The rabbis noticed that plural and built on it, his blood and the blood of the descendants he would never have, which is where that Mishnah passage about a single life and a whole world comes from. In the ground again, the Adama, cursed already, and now it has swallowed something and is calling out about it. Cain is sent east, to the land of Nod, which means wandering, and he is given a mark. And it is worth saying clearly, because it has been misused so badly. The mark is protective. The text says explicitly that it is set on him, lest any finding him should kill him. It is a mercy given to a murderer. Then comes something that surprises most people who have not looked at chapter 4 in a while. Cain builds a city, and he called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. The first city in the Bible is founded by the first murderer and named for his child. And from that line, the text gives us the origins of the crafts. Jabal, the father of such as dwell in tents and have cattle. Jubal, the father of all such as handle the harp and organ. And Tubal-Cain, an instructor of every artificer in brass and iron. Herding, music, metalwork, those three, in that order, out of Cain's line. Now, Tubal-Cain. This name has attracted a great deal of scholarly attention because Tubal was a real place, a kingdom in southeastern Anatolia, in the region of the Taurus Mountains, well attested in Assyrian records of the first millennium before Christ, and famous in antiquity for one thing above all: metal. The Taurus is one of the great ancient sources of copper and silver, and Tubal was a center of metallurgy. So the Bible's first metalworker carries a name that echoes the name of the region the ancient world associated with metalworking. That is a real observation with a real literature behind it. And John Day, among others, has worked through the connections between the Cain line and the Kenites, a metalworking people on the southern edge of Israel, whose name in Hebrew, Keni, is built on the same consonants as Cain. What do we do with that? Carefully is the answer. One reading is that the genealogy preserves a genuine ethnographic memory, that Israel knew who the Smiths were and where they came from, and that this knowledge is embedded here in the form of a family tree. That is how ancient peoples generally stored such information, as descent. Another reading is that this is a literary construction from the start, associating the arts of civilization with the line of the murderer, as a comment on what civilization is made of. Those two are not exclusive. Ancient genealogies routinely did both jobs at once. And I will add one small note about Cain's own name, because it is the sort of thing that gets lost. When Eve names him, the text gives the reason. I have gotten a man from the Lord. The Hebrew verb is kana, to get, to acquire. Cain and Kana, another of these sound echoes. Abel's name is Hevel, and Hevel is the word that opens the book of Ecclesiastes. Vanity of vanities, vapor, breath, a thing that is there and then is not. The brother whose name means breath is the one whose life is short. Whether the writer intended that or the language handed it to him, it is there in the text, and every Hebrew reader has always heard it. The chapter closes on a strange, dark little poem, the Song of Lamech, 5 generations down from Cain, boasting to his 2 wives that he has killed a man for wounding him, and that if Cain was avenged 7-fold, Lamech will be avenged 70 and 7-fold. It is the oldest piece of verse in Genesis, probably older than the prose around it, and its subject is escalation. The mark that was given to Cain to stop the killing has become, in his descendants' mouth, a warrant for more of it. And then, in the last 2 verses of the chapter, in a completely different register, another son is born to Adam and Eve, and named Seth, and to Seth a son named Enos. And the chapter ends with a sentence so quiet that it is easy to read straight past. Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. No fanfare, no miracle. After a murder, a wandering, a city, a boast about revenge. Somewhere out of shot, people started praying. That is how the 4th chapter ends, not with a resolution, with a small, persistent human noise starting up in the background and continuing. Which brings us to the list. Before we read it, one word about how the book of Genesis is put together, because it explains why this chapter is here at all. 11 times in Genesis, a formula appears. These are the generations of. The Hebrew noun is toledot, from the verb yalad, to bear or beget. It might be rendered as begettings or descendants, or simply, this is what came of. The formula divides the whole book. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth, of Adam, of Noah, of the sons of Noah, of Shem, of Terah, of Ishmael, of Isaac, of Esau twice, of Jacob, and in every case the heading points forward, not back. The generations of Terah is not the story of Terah. It is the story of what came out of Terah, which is Abraham. The generations of Isaac is the story of Jacob. So the book is built as a series of narrowing funnels. Everything, then one line out of everything, then one line out of that. Heaven and earth, then humanity, then one family, then one son. This is not a modern discovery, and it is not a critical theory. It is the book's own visible skeleton, printed in the text, and it was noticed by Jewish and Christian commentators long before anybody wrote a scholarly monograph. What it tells us is that a list is not an interruption in Genesis. A list is the load-bearing structure. The narratives hang off the genealogies rather than the other way round, and a chapter of names is the book doing exactly what it was built to do. That is worth carrying into the next few minutes, because we are about to spend them on names. The 5th chapter of Genesis is the one everybody skips, and it is the one I want to spend the longest on, because it is the chapter that most directly touches the prism turning on its spindle. 10 names, from Adam to Noah. Each one gets the same formula. He lived so many years and begat a son, and he lived so many years after that, and all his days were so many years, and he died. Adam, 930. Seth, 912. Enos, 905. Canaan, 910. Mahalaleel, 895. Jared, 962. Enoch, 365. Methuselah, 969. Lamech, 777. Noah, 950. Now put beside it the antediluvian section of the Sumerian King List from the Prism in Oxford. After kingship came down from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. In Eridu, Alulim became king, and he ruled 28,800 years. Alongar ruled 36,000 years. 2 kings, 64,800 years. Then Eridu fell, and kingship passed to Bad Tabira, and so on, through 5 cities, Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, and 8 kings, for a total in that version of 241,200 years. And then the floods swept over. Different numbers by orders of magnitude. But look at the shape. A fixed set of names before a flood. A repeating formula. Enormous rains or lifespans. A flood as the boundary between one kind of time and another. And after the flood, the numbers collapse toward the ordinary. That last point is worth dwelling on, because it holds in both traditions. In the King List, the post-diluvian rains come down and down until they reach lengths a historian can work with. In Genesis, the same thing happens in chapter 11. The lifespans after the flood fall away steadily, from Shem's 600 to Terah's 205, and by the time we reach Abraham, we are in a world of ordinary human ages. Both lists describe a diminishment. Both put the hinge at the same event. So what are the numbers doing? Let me lay out the possibilities as fairly as I can, because this is a place where honest people disagree, and where the disagreement is often conducted badly. The first possibility is the plain one. The numbers are years, meant as years, and human beings lived that long before the flood, and stopped afterward. This has been the majority Christian and Jewish reading for most of the last 2,000 years. It is held today by a great many serious people. It is what the text says, on its face, in the ordinary sense of the words. The second possibility is that the numbers are notation of a kind we no longer use. The Mesopotamian scribes counted in base 60. That is why we still have 60 seconds in a minute and 360 degrees in a circle. Their large unit was the sar, which is 3,600, 60 squared. Every reign in the antediluvian king list is a whole number of sars or half-sars. Alulim's 28,800 years is 8 sars. Alongar's 36,000 is 10. Those are not measurements. They are a system. The Italian-Israeli scholar Umberto Cassuto, in his commentary on Genesis published in Jerusalem in 1961, noticed that the Genesis numbers cluster in a pattern too. Most of them are multiples of 5, or multiples of 5 with a 7 added, and Methuselah's has 7 added twice. The French scholar Michel Barnouin, in an article in the Revue Biblique in 1970, pushed further and proposed astronomical correspondences, that certain totals match the synodic periods of the planets as the Babylonians calculated them, the intervals at which a planet returns to the same position in the sky. Barnouin's arithmetic is intricate, and some of it is disputed, but one observation in it is hard to walk past. Enoch, the 7th from Adam, lives 365 years. 365. The number of days in a solar year, in a chapter where nobody else's total is anywhere near it, attached to the one man in the list who does not die. And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. The third possibility is honorific, that great ages are how the ancient world said great, the way a modern eulogy says a man was larger than life. On this reading, the numbers are not measurements or codes, but a register of respect, and asking what they encode is like asking what temperature a warm welcome is. Where do I come down? I will tell you, and then I will tell you why I hold it loosely. I think the second and third possibilities are probably closer to each other than they look, and I think both of them are compatible with reading the chapter reverently. The numbers are doing something, whether that something is calendrical, sexagesimal, honorific, or some combination. The pattern in them is real and was noticed by Jewish commentators centuries before any of us. But I hold that loosely because the honest position is that nobody has produced a decoding that convinces the field. Cassuto's arithmetic contains errors that later scholars have caught. Barnawan's correspondences work beautifully in some places and require special pleading in others. And there is a version of this conversation I dislike, which treats the discovery of a pattern as a demolition. It is not. A pattern in the numbers tells you the writer was doing something careful. It does not tell you he was doing something dishonest. There is one more witness to bring in here, and he is a good one, because he stood exactly where we are standing, between the cuneiform tradition and the biblical one, and he stood there more than 2,000 years ago. His name was Berosus, a priest of Marduk in Babylon. Around 281 years before Christ, in the reign of the Seleucid king Antiochus I, he wrote a history of Babylonia in Greek in 3 books. He called it, in effect, the Babyloniaca. His work is lost. What we have of it comes down through a chain that tells you a great deal about how ancient knowledge survives. Berosus was quoted by Alexander Polyhistor in the 1st century before Christ, who was quoted by Eusebius of Caesarea in the 4th century after Christ, whose Greek is largely lost, but survives in an Armenian translation, and in the work of the Byzantine chronicler George Syncellus around the year 800. 4 hands, over 1,000 years, and the text still arrives. And what Berosus reports is a list of 10 kings before the flood, not 8. The last of them he calls Xisuthros, which is a Greek rendering of the Sumerian name Ziusudra. 10 generations before the flood, with the flood hero 10th. Genesis has 10 generations before the flood, with Noah 10th. That is a real correspondence, noted by scholars since the 19th century, and it is one of the reasons the comparison between these lists has never gone away. Whether it reflects a shared inheritance, a shared literary convention, or a coincidence of round numbers, is exactly the kind of question the field argues about, and I am content to leave it argued. Berosus adds one detail I love. In his account, before the flood, the hero is instructed to take all the writings, the beginnings, the middles, and the ends of everything that had been written down, and bury them in the city of Sippar for safekeeping, and dig them up afterward. A civilization whose deepest instinct, faced with the end of the world, is to bury the library. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in Rome at the end of the 1st century after Christ, has a version of the same instinct in his own tradition. In the 1st book of the Antiquities, he reports that the children of Seth worked out the science of the heavenly bodies and heard from Adam that the world would be destroyed once by fire and once by water. So they made 2 pillars, one of brick and one of stone, and inscribed their discoveries on both, so that if the flood took the brick one, the stone one would survive. And, Josephus adds, it remains in the land of Syriad to this day. Now, that is not a matter of record. Josephus is reporting a tradition current in his own time, roughly 2,000 years after the events he is describing. and no such pillar has ever been identified. He was a 1st century historian, repeating a 1st century story about the deep past, which is what a great deal of ancient history consists of. But look at what the story is about. Both of these traditions, Babylonian and Jewish, when they imagine the world ending, imagine somebody trying to get the writing through. It is the same anxiety that put a hole through the middle of that prism in Oxford so it could be turned and read and copied again. And it is worth saying plainly that the anxiety was justified because almost everything did get lost. The Babylonica is gone. The Library of Alexandria is gone. What we have of the ancient world is what happened to be baked, buried, or copied one more time by somebody who thought it mattered. Which is why we can read the King List at all. Ashurbanipal's palace burned, and the fire saved the tablets. 2 more things about the 5th chapter before we go on. The first is the sentence at the end of the list, when Lamech names his son. And he called his name Noah, saying, "This same shall comfort us concerning our work and toil of our hands, because of the ground which the Lord hath cursed." That is another Hebrew sound play, and a slightly awkward one. The name Noach sits close to the verb nuach, to rest, and the explanation given uses a different verb, naham, to comfort. Commentators have argued about the looseness of the fit since antiquity. But look at what Lamech says. This one will bring us relief from the work and the toil of our hands, because of the ground that was cursed. He is naming his son after the 3rd chapter. 5 generations on, and the sweat and the thorns are still the thing everybody is thinking about. And a father looks at a newborn and hopes he is the end of it. That is the most human sentence in the chapter, and it is set in the middle of all those enormous numbers like a small warm stone. The second thing is Methuselah, and it is a piece of arithmetic anybody can do at the kitchen table. Methuselah is the oldest man in the list, at 969. Add up the figures the chapter gives. Methuselah's age when Lamech is born, Lamech's age when Noah is born, and Noah's age when the flood comes, and the numbers land on the same year. Methuselah dies in the year of the flood. Whether that is the point or an accident of the arithmetic, it has been noticed by readers for a very long time, and it means the longest life in the Bible ends exactly where the Old World ends, which is where we are going next. 4 verses at the head of the 6th chapter have generated more discussion, per word, than almost anything else in the Hebrew Bible. I am going to handle them slowly and with both hands, because they are also the part of Genesis most often turned into something lurid, and that is not what we are doing tonight. Here is what the text says. The sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. That is the whole of it. 4 verses, and then the text moves straight on to the wickedness of man and the decision to send the flood. The Hebrew phrase behind sons of God is Bnei ha-Elohim. Elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, that phrase appears in the book of Job, in the 1st and 2nd chapters, where the sons of God present themselves before the Lord, and in the 38th, where they shout for joy at the founding of the earth. In those passages, it clearly denotes heavenly beings. The word rendered giants is Nephilim, and it is not really a word for size. It appears only here and in the book of Numbers, in the report of the spies, and its derivation is uncertain, most often connected to the root naphal, to fall, which is where the phrase fallen ones comes from. The King James translators used giants because the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, used gigantes, and because of what the spies say in Numbers about the size of the people they saw. There are three main readings, and all three are ancient. The oldest attested reading takes the sons of God as angelic beings. This is what we find in the earliest Jewish literature that comments on the passage, and above all in the Book of the Watchers, which forms the first 36 chapters of the composite work known as First Enoch. The Book of the Watchers is not a modern rediscovery, and it is not a suppressed gospel. It is a Jewish text written in Aramaic, and the scholarly consensus dates its earliest portions to the 3rd century before Christ. 11 Aramaic fragments of Enoch were found in Cave 4 at Qumran in 1948, and they were published and studied by Joseph Millick and Matthew Black at Oxford in 1976. The oldest of those manuscripts is dated on paleographic grounds to somewhere between 200 and 150 years before Christ. So we have physical copies from before the Christian era, and the composition is older than the copies. In the Watchers, the sons of God are angels who descend, led by figures named Shemihazah and Asael, and their offense is twofold. They take human wives, and they teach humanity things it was not meant to know: metalworking and weapons, cosmetics, sorcery, the reading of signs. That second element is worth noticing, because it is not in Genesis at all. The Enochic tradition connects the corruption of the world to illicit knowledge, and specifically to technologies of violence and of appearance. The New Testament book of Jude quotes 1 Enoch directly, and the letters of Jude and 2 Peter both refer to angels who sinned and were kept in chains, in contexts that mention the flood. So the angelic reading is not fringe within early Christianity either. It was the majority view among the earliest church writers. The second reading takes the sons of God to be the line of Seth, and the daughters of men to be the line of Cain, righteous men marrying corrupt women, and the two lines that chapters 4 and 5 so carefully separated collapsing back together. This reading appears with Julius Africanus in the early 3rd century and is developed fully by Augustine in the 15th book of the City of God in the early 5th. From Augustine it became the standard Western reading for well over 1,000 years, and it is what most of us were taught if we were taught anything. Its appeal is obvious. It keeps the categories of creature and creator clean. It locates the cause of the flood in human moral failure where the rest of the chapter locates it, and it uses the two genealogies that Genesis has just given us. Its difficulty, as its critics point out, is that sons of God is not used anywhere else in the Hebrew Bible to mean righteous human beings, and that the offspring being described as mighty men of renown is a strange result for an ordinary intermarriage. The third reading takes the sons of God as human rulers, kings and dynasts who claimed divine descent, which was standard royal ideology across the ancient Near East, where kings were routinely described as sons of a god. On this view, the sin is tyranny, and the seizure of women by the powerful, and they took wives of all which they chose, is the operative phrase. 3 readings: ancient, respectable, and mutually exclusive, held by serious Jews and serious Christians for 2,000 years. I am not going to adjudicate between them, and I want to be honest that this is not evasion. I have read the arguments for many years, and I do not think the text gives us enough to decide. But I will tell you what I notice, and this is the third place tonight where I am offering you my own reading rather than the field's. The reading I find most persuasive is that the passage is deliberately compressed, that it is telling us less than it knows, and that the compression is the point. Look at the size of it. 4 verses. This is the most extraordinary claim in the primeval history, whatever it means, and the text gives it about 90 words and moves on. No description of the sons of God, no account of how it happened, no names. The Book of the Watchers takes that same material and spends 36 chapters on it, with names, hierarchies, and a full mythology. Genesis knows something like the Watchers material exists. It gestures at it, and then it declines to tell it. I think that reticence is doing exactly what the unnamed sun and moon in chapter 1 are doing. There is a whole world of ancient story about divine beings and human women and the heroes born from them. The Greeks are full of it, the Mesopotamians are full of it, and Genesis touches the edge of it, says the wrong that came of it, and refuses the material. Whatever happened, the text says, it is not the story. The story is what God did next. And what God does next is the most affecting verse in the chapter, and one that has troubled theologians since origin. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart. The Hebrew verb is nacham, the same root Lamech used when he named Noah and hoped for comfort. And the second phrase is stronger in Hebrew than in English. It caused him pain in his heart. Here is what I want you to hold, because it is the difference between this account and every other flood story in the ancient world. And it is the reason I find Genesis 6 so unlike its neighbors. In the Atrahasis epic, the reason for the flood is stated plainly. Humanity has multiplied. The noise they make is too much. The god Enlil cannot sleep for the racket of them. That is the motive. Overpopulation and noise. The gods first try plague, then drought, then famine, and each time the hero Atrahasis is tipped off by the god Enki, and each time the remedy is deflected. And finally, Enlil resolves on the flood. In Genesis, the reason is moral. The earth is filled with violence. The Hebrew word is Hamas, which means precisely that. Violent injustice, the strong taking from the weak. And the response is not annoyance, it is grief. I am not saying that to score a point off Babylon. I have too much respect for the Atrahasis poet, and the Mesopotamian material contains its own extraordinary depths. I am saying it because it is the load-bearing difference, and because if you take nothing else from tonight about the flood, that is the thing to take. In one account, the world ends because heaven is irritated. In the other, the world ends because heaven is heartbroken. Everything downstream of that follows from it, including, in the end, the bow in the cloud. But before the bow, the water, and before the water, the boat. Make thee an ark of gopher wood. Rooms shalt thou make in the ark, and shalt pitch it within and without with pitch. 300 cubits long, 50 broad, 30 high. A cubit is roughly 18 inches, so we are looking at something around 450 feet by 75 by 45. A long rectangular box, 3 decks, 1 door, 1 window. Gopher wood is a mystery. The Hebrew word appears once in the whole Bible, here, and nobody knows what tree it is. Cypress is the usual guess. The truthful answer is that we have a technical term from a vanished vocabulary and no way to check it. The pitch is not a mystery at all. The word is kopher, and it means bitumen, the natural asphalt that seeps out of the ground across Mesopotamia and floats up in the Dead Sea, and which the ancient world used to waterproof everything from roofs to reed boats. Now let us put beside it the Babylonian boat, because the comparison is one of the most concrete things in this whole field. In the 11th tablet of Gilgamesh, the flood hero is called Utnapishtim, and he tells the story to Gilgamesh, who has come looking for him because he does not want to die. Utnapishtim's boat is a cube, equal in length and width and height, with 7 decks, divided into 9 compartments, sealed with bitumen and pitch inside and out. In Atrahasis, the older poem written out by Ipigaya in the 17th century before Christ, the hero is Atrahasis, whose name means extra wise. The boat instructions there are damaged, but the roof and the bitumen are present. In the Eridu Genesis, the Sumerian version that Arno Poebel published in 1914 from a broken tablet dug out of Nippur, the hero is Zayusudra, a king of Shuruppak, and he is warned by the wall. The god Enki speaks to him through the reed wall of his house so as not to break the oath of secrecy the gods have sworn. That detail about the wall is one of the loveliest pieces of misdirection in ancient literature. The god has sworn not to tell the man, so he tells the wall, loudly, while the man happens to be standing on the other side of it. And then there is the Ark tablet. Irving Finkel's tablet, the one Douglas Simmons brought into the British Museum in 1985, and Finkel finally got to read after 14 years, dates on internal grounds to somewhere between 1900 and 1700 years before Christ. It measures about 4.5 inches by 2.5. It has exactly 60 lines on it, written cleanly and without error, and it is a set of building instructions. The god tells the man to knock down his reed house and build a boat. It specifies the palm fiber rope, the wooden ribs, the quantities of hot bitumen for waterproofing, and it specifies the shape. It is a coracle, a round boat. Coracles were ordinary river craft in Mesopotamia for thousands of years. Circular, made of coiled rope and reed over a wooden frame, sealed with bitumen, used as ferries and cargo carriers on the Tigris and Euphrates. Herodotus describes them. They were still in use in Iraq in living memory. The boat on the tablet is a coracle scaled up beyond all sense. The floor area works out at something like 3,600 square meters, roughly 2/3 of a football pitch, with walls about 6 meters high. Finkel calculated that the rope specified, laid end to end, would stretch from London to Edinburgh. He described the moment of realizing the boat was round as heart-stopping. I believe him. He also, with a documentary team, built a 1/3 scale version and put it in the water, and it floated, with some leaking. Now, and this is important, that tablet is not the Bible's ark, and Finkel does not claim it is. He takes the view that the flood tradition reached the Jewish community during the Babylonian exile in the 6th century before Christ. That is his reading, and other scholars date the transmission earlier or reconstruct it differently. What the tablet tells us for certain is narrower and more interesting. It tells us that the flood story circulated in the ancient Near East in versions detailed enough to specify rope quantities, and that the shape of the boat was not fixed across those versions. Round in one, a cube in another, a long box in Genesis, the story traveled, the specifications did not. There is one more comparison worth making, and it is the one that always stops me. In Gilgamesh, when the water has gone down and the boat has grounded, Utnapishtim releases birds, a dove which comes back, a swallow which comes back, a raven which does not. In Genesis, Noah releases a raven, which goes to and fro, then a dove which comes back because it finds no rest for the sole of her foot, then the dove again, and it returns in the evening with an olive leaf, then the dove a third time, and it does not return. Same procedure, different birds, different order, different rhythm. And after the landing, in both, a sacrifice. And in Gilgamesh, a line that has disturbed readers for 150 years. The gods smell the sweet savor and gather over the offering like flies. Like flies, because they have been without offerings for the length of the flood, and they are hungry, because in Mesopotamian theology, the offerings are how the gods are fed. That is what humanity was made for in Atrahasis. That is the whole economy. Genesis has the same phrase and drops the flies, and the Lord smelled a sweet savor, and then a promise instead of a meal. Now let me put you in the water, because we have been talking about texts for a long time, and this is a story about weather. It is spring in the lower plain. The barley is nearly ready. Somewhere 800 miles north, in mountains nobody in this town has ever seen, the winter snow is going off the high ground all at once because the season turned warm early. The river has been rising for days. That is normal. It rises every year, and the town is built where it is because it rises. The flood is what puts the silt on the fields. But this year it does not stop. The first thing that happens is not dramatic. Water comes up through the floor. Not over the threshold, through the floor, because a mud brick house sits on beaten earth over a water table, and when the table rises, the ground weeps. People move things up, grain jars onto the roof, bedding onto the roof, the children onto the roof. Then the rain, which is the wrong rain, coming down out of a sky the color of wet ash, hour after hour after hour, and the noise of it on reed matting is the loudest sound in the world, and it does not stop. And here is the thing about a mud brick town in the rain, and it is why the archaeology of Mesopotamia looks the way it does. Sun-dried mud brick is not waterproof. It never was. It is a superb material, cheap, insulating, easy, and it dissolves. A wall standing in rising water does not fall like a stone wall falls. It softens, it slumps, it goes back into the mud it came out of, quietly, over hours, and the roof comes down onto the floor. The animals go first, in the fields. Then the outlying reed houses, which simply lift and go. Then the mud brick, street by street, and the streets are already channels. The smell is the part nobody writes down. Wet clay, which is the smell of a wet flower pot, enormously multiplied. Drowned barley, smoke that will not draw. And later, when the water stands, the smell of standing water in a hot country. Somewhere in the middle of it, a man with a boat, and everybody else without one. How long? The water prevailed upon the earth in 150 days. You do not need me to tell you what 5 months of that is. And I am going to move on, because it is late and there is no reason to keep you in the water. But I did not want to give you a paper flood, with a paper rainbow over it. The people who told this story knew exactly what a flood smelled like. Which brings us to the archaeology, and to a piece of history that has been badly retold for 90 years, and which I want to set straight gently. In 1929, Leonard Woolley was excavating at He had just finished the Royal Cemetery, with its astonishing gold, and he sank a small shaft into the ground below it, a pit, at first about 5 feet square. Below the occupation debris he hit clean silt, water-laid, sterile, no pottery in it, no bone. He widened the sounding into a proper pit, 75 feet by 60, eventually going down 64 feet. The clean layer was up to about 11 or 12 feet thick. Below it, more human occupation. Woolley announced it. His wife Catherine is generally credited with the phrase that went round the world. They had found the flood. Now here is where the popular story and the record part company, and I want to be precise, because this episode gets used badly in both directions. Woolley never claimed a global deluge. He argued for a catastrophic local inundation of the Tigris and Euphrates Valley. Devastating enough, as he put it, that to the people living through it, that was the whole world. Second, other flood layers turned up elsewhere. Stephen Langdon at Kish, north of announced a similar deposit. Eric Schmidt found one at Shuruppak, which is Ziusudra's own city in the Sumerian tradition, so that was a genuinely striking result. And third, when the dating was worked through, the layers did not match each other. Woolley's deposit is very early, generally placed around 3,500 years before Christ, or earlier. The Kish layers and the Shuruppak layer sit later, in the range around 3,000 to 2,900. They are not one event. They are several floods, at several cities, across several centuries. Woolley's own chief assistant, Max Mallowan, did not accept his identification, and later argued in a well-known paper that if any archaeological flood horizon lies behind the Mesopotamian tradition, it is more likely the Kish and Shuruppak material than the silt. Woolley himself, in the end, backed away from the identification on the grounds that his deposit was too old. I have read the excavation notes on this, and I want to be fair to everybody. By modern standards, the recording of these deposits is poor. It is not always possible to reconstruct how many soundings Woolley found flood remains in. Attempts to dismiss the silt as windblown sand are not well supported either. The most defensible summary is this: Southern Mesopotamia experienced repeated, severe, city-destroying floods across the 4th and 3rd millennia before Christ. Several of them left thick, sterile deposits that excavators have found. None of them is demonstrably the flood of the traditions, and the traditions do not carry the kind of date that would let us check. That is a genuinely uncertain result, and I am not going to dress it up in either direction. What I will say is that the tradition is not floating free of the landscape. This is a country whose cities were periodically destroyed by water, whose literature is full of it, and which produced at least 4 independent written flood narratives before Genesis was compiled. Something in that land taught people to tell this story, and to keep telling it, and to bury the tablets so it would survive. And the ark rested in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, upon the mountains of Ararat. Read that carefully, because the King James is more accurate here than the popular memory of it. The text does not say Mount Ararat. It says the mountains of Ararat, plural. Ararat is not a peak in the Hebrew Bible. It is a country. The consonants correspond to Urartu, the name Assyrian scribes gave to the kingdom north of them, in the highlands around Lake Van in what is now eastern Turkey and Armenia. Urartu appears in Assyrian records from the late 2nd millennium onward, and was a serious rival power in the 9th and 8th centuries before Christ. The prophet Jeremiah, writing around 600 years before Christ, refers to the kingdom of Ararat alongside Mini and Ashkenaz, and at that moment the kingdom in question was calling itself Urartu. So Genesis 8 verse 4 says, "The boat came to rest somewhere in the mountainous north." It does not name a summit. The great volcanic cone that we now call Mount Ararat, rising above the Aras Valley, acquired that name comparatively late. The Armenians have always called it Masis, and the other traditions place it elsewhere entirely. In Gilgamesh, the boat grounds on Mount Nisr, generally located east of Assyria in the Zagros. Berossus, as quoted by Josephus, puts the remains in the mountain of the Chaldeans, that is, of the Kurds. The Syriac tradition, and later the Islamic, settled on Mount Judi, called Kudi in Turkish and Kardu in Aramaic, in what is now Shirnak province in southeastern Turkey. Josephus reports, in the first book of the Antiquities, that Berossus recorded that some part of the vessel still survived in Armenia, and that people carried off pieces of the bitumen to use as amulets against misfortune. He cites 2 further Greek writers, Hieronymus the Egyptian and Nicolaus of Damascus, to the same effect. That is a 1st century historian citing a 3rd century before Christ Babylonian priest reporting a local practice. I offer it as exactly that, and not as evidence for anything on a mountain. What it does document is that by the Hellenistic period, there were people in the Armenian highlands selling bitumen as relics, which is its own small window into the ancient world. Then the water goes down, and the 8th chapter does something remarkable in 3 words. And God remembered Noah. The Hebrew verb zakar, to remember, does not primarily mean recalling something that had slipped your mind. In biblical usage, it means to turn one's attention toward, to act on behalf of. When Israel later cries out in Egypt, God remembers his covenant, and the remembering is the beginning of the rescue. But it lands in a story about a man in a box in the dark for months, with a particular weight. And then the world dries, slowly and in stages, and the birds go out, and eventually the door opens. And here is what I think is the true climax of the primeval history. And it is not the flood. It is what God says to himself after it. I will not again curse the ground anymore for man's sake. For the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I again smite any more while the earth remaineth, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. Look at the logic of that. The reason given for never doing it again is the same reason that was given for doing it in the first place. Human beings have not changed. The verdict has changed. And the promise is not a promise of protection. It is a promise about the calendar. Seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night. In an agricultural civilization dependent on the annual behavior of two rivers, there is no more consequential promise available. What the flood account ends with is not an assurance that nothing bad will happen. It is an assurance that the seasons will keep turning. And then the sign, I do set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a token of a covenant between me and the earth. The Hebrew word is keshet, and it is not a special word for a rainbow. It is the ordinary word for a bow, the weapon, the thing an archer draws. Ancient Near Eastern art is full of storm gods with bows, firing lightning. The bow in the cloud is standing military equipment for a deity in that world. And what Genesis says is that the bow has been set in the cloud, hung up, and when you look at where it points, its curve is turned away from the earth. That is an observation many commentators have made, and I think it is right. Whether or not the writer intended the detail of the direction, the choice of the word keshet is deliberate, and the sign of the covenant is a weapon put down. The 9th chapter then does something that surprises people who remember only the rainbow. Noah plants a vineyard. He makes wine. He drinks it, and he is drunk, and he lies uncovered in his tent. His son Ham sees him and tells his brothers. Shem and Japheth walk in backward with a garment over their shoulders and cover him without looking. And when Noah wakes, he curses Canaan. I want to say several plain things about this passage, because it has been put to horrifying use, and the honest handling of it matters. First, what the text actually says. The curse falls on Canaan, who is Ham's son, and not on Ham. That is what is on the page, and it has puzzled commentators for 2,000 years. Second, what the text does not say. It does not describe skin color. It does not describe Africa. It says nothing whatsoever about race. The name Canaan in the Hebrew Bible refers to the land and peoples of the southern Levant, the country Israel would later occupy, and the great majority of scholars understand the passage as an origin story about the relationship between Israel and the Canaanite city-states. Third, and I say this with sorrow rather than heat, this passage was used from the early modern period onward to justify the enslavement of African peoples, in a reading that has no support in the words. The linguist David Goldenberg, in a detailed study published by Princeton in 2003, worked through the etymologies and found no basis for connecting the name Ham with darkness, blackness, or any such thing. That misuse is a matter of documented historical record, and it should be named as what it was, a misreading pressed into the service of a crime. I raise it because you may have heard of it and wondered, and because I would rather you heard it handled carefully at 1 a.m. by somebody who has read the sources than encounter it somewhere louder. And I will leave it there and move on, because the 10th chapter is where the world opens back out. The 10th chapter of Genesis is called, by scholars, the Table of Nations, and it is one of the most unusual documents to survive from the ancient world. It is a map in the form of a family tree. 70 names, descended from Noah's 3 sons, and every one of them is a people, a place, or a city rather than an individual. The genealogy is a way of saying, here is the world, and here is how it fits together. Nothing quite like it survives from anywhere else in antiquity. There are Mesopotamian geographical lists, and there are Egyptian lists of foreign lands, but they are inventories of subjects and tributaries. The Table of Nations is not an imperial list. It is a description of the human family from the point of view of a small people in the middle of it. And it is largely identifiable. Japheth's descendants go north and west. Javan is the Ionians. The Greeks. The correspondence is exact. The Hebrew Yawan is the Greek Iawans, which is where Ionia comes from, and the Assyrians called the Greeks Yanai. Madai is the Medes. Meshech and Tubal are Anatolian regions known from Assyrian records as Mushki and Tabal. Under Javan we get Elisha, generally identified with Alashia, which was the ancient name for Cyprus, or a region of it, known from late Bronze Age correspondence as a great source of copper. Hittim is Kitchen, on Cyprus. Tarshish is disputed. Tartessos in southern Spain is one candidate, Tarsus in Cilicia another, and Josephus took the second view. Ham's descendants go south and along the coasts. Cush, Mizraim, which is Egypt, Put, and Canaan. Shem's go east and into Arabia and Mesopotamia. Elam, Ashur, Aram, and the line that leads to Eber, from whom the word Hebrew is usually derived. The Egyptologist and historian Kenneth Kitchen of the University of Liverpool worked through this chapter in detail in his book on the reliability of the Old Testament, and his assessment is worth reporting because it is measured rather than triumphal. From a Levantine viewpoint, he observed, Japheth's groupings are consistently northern, Anatolia, northwestern Iran, the Aegean, and the eastern Mediterranean. The geography is coherent. It is the world as seen from Canaan. And in the middle of the chapter, an odd little biography breaks the pattern. And Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh, in the land of Shinar, 4 cities. Babel is Babylon. Erech is Uruk, the great southern city where writing was invented. Akkad is Akkad, the capital of Sargon's empire in the 24th century before Christ, whose site has never been found. Calneh is uncertain, and Shinar is Sumer, the western name for the southern Mesopotamian plain. So the Bible's account of the First Empire places it exactly where the First Empire actually was, and names 3 cities that are real, 2 of which have been excavated, and the third of which is attested in hundreds of texts. Who was Nimrod? Nobody knows, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. Proposals have included Sargon of Akkad, the Assyrian king Tukulti-Ninurta, and the god Ninurta, who was a divine hunter and warrior. None has carried the field. The name resists derivation from Akkadian or Sumerian, and its Hebrew form invites a connection with the root marad, to rebel, which may well be a deliberate reshaping. What the tradition did with him is a separate matter and is clearly labeled as tradition. Josephus, in the 1st century, made Nimrod the instigator of the tower, describing him as a bold man who urged people to build so high the water could never reach them again, an act of defiance rather than construction. The Talmud takes the same view, and so does the later Midrash. None of that is in Genesis. Genesis never connects Nimrod to the tower at all. It is a very old and very widespread piece of interpretation, which has become so familiar that most people assume it is in the text, which it is not. But the tower is next. And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. The Hebrew is more concrete than that, one lip and one set of words. And they journeyed from the east and found a plain in the land of Shinar and dwelt there. And they said one to another, Go to, let us make brick and burn them throughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime they had for mortar. I want to stop on that verse, because it is the single most quietly authenticating detail in the whole of Genesis 1-11, and almost nobody notices it. The writer stops the narrative to explain a building material. They had brick for stone and slime for mortar. That aside is written for somebody who does not live there, somebody in the Judean hill country, where you build with stone because the whole country is limestone, and where the idea of a great tower made of baked mud would need explaining. And it is exactly right. Southern Mesopotamia has no building stone. What it has is clay and bitumen. Every monumental structure on that plain, from the 4th millennium to the fall of Babylon, is brick set in bitumen. And note the detail about burning them thoroughly. Sun-dried brick is what you build a house with, and it dissolves, as we have already seen. Kiln-fired brick is expensive because firing takes fuel, and fuel is scarce, and it is what you use when you intend something to last. The builders in Genesis 11 are not making ordinary bricks. They are making the expensive kind, the text notices. So what were they building? A tower whose top may reach unto heaven. The standard Mesopotamian answer to that description is a ziggurat, a stepped tower of mud brick, faced with fired brick, rising in terraces, with a shrine on top. They were built across the plain from the late 3rd millennium onward. The one at which Woolley excavated, is the best preserved, and the greatest of them stood in Babylon, and it was called Etemenanki, which in Sumerian means the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. Finding it was a problem of water. The site of Babylon has a high water table, and the ziggurat's remains sit in what is effectively a wetland. The German architect and archaeologist Robert Koldewey, who excavated Babylon for the German Oriental Society from 1899, had located the Isagila, the Temple of Marduk, by 1901, which told him the tower could not be far away. But the ground was too wet to dig. He had to wait. In 1913, the water level dropped unusually low, and Koldewey went in and found the foundations. The ground plan measured about 91.5 meters by 91 2/3, a square roughly 300 feet on a side. And here is the part I find genuinely thrilling, in the quiet way that archaeology is thrilling. We already had the specification. A cuneiform tablet written at Uruk in the year 229 before Christ, now in the Louvre, and known as the Isagila tablet, is a copy of an older document giving the tower's dimensions. It describes 7 stages. It gives the height of each. The total comes to 91 meters, 91 meters square at the base, and 91 meters tall. A cube, in effect, in 7 steps. Koldewey's measured foundations and the ancient tablet agree. That is what a good day in this field looks like. A text written by a Babylonian scholar in the 3rd century before Christ, copying something older, and a German architect with a trowel, 2,142 years later, and the numbers match. There is more. A black stone stele, 47 centimeters high, shows a Babylonian king in profile alongside a front view of a stepped tower and a plan of the sanctuary on its summit. A 3-line inscription beside the tower identifies it as Etemenanki in Babylon, and a longer inscription below is a variant of known texts of Nebuchadnezzar II, who reigned in the 6th century before Christ. The stele was for many years in the private Shoyan collection, catalogued as manuscript 2063, and it has since been returned to the Iraq Museum in Baghdad. It was published in detail by the Swedish Assyriologist Olof Peterson in the journal Iraq in 2024. So we have the foundations, the measurements, and a picture of it with the king standing beside it. Now, the necessary caution, and I want to give it as plainly as I have given the rest. None of that proves that Etemenanki is the tower of Genesis 11. The ziggurat Koldewey found is a Neo-Babylonian structure, rebuilt repeatedly, and its earlier phases are hard to reach through the groundwater. The Genesis account is not dated within the text. What the archaeology establishes is that the kind of building described in Genesis 11 existed, in that place, made of exactly those materials, with exactly that ambition, and that the ambition was stated in the building's own names. The house of the foundation of heaven and earth. A ziggurat is not a temple you go inside. It is a stair. Its function is to connect the ground to the sky at one designated point, and the Babylonians said so in writing on their own foundation cylinders. Let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. Two motives, stated in one breath. Let us make a name, and lest we be scattered. Reputation and fear, together, that is a very fine piece of observation about why people build things, and it has not dated at all. And then the verse that has more irony in it than any other in Genesis. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of men builded. The tower whose top reaches heaven, and God has to come down to look at it. Now the word, Babel. In Akkadian, the city's name is Babilu, and Babylonian scribes explained it as Babili, gate of the god. That is what the Babylonians thought their city was called, and what they thought it meant. Modern Assyriologists mostly regard that as a folk etymology. The name is probably older than Akkadian and possibly pre-Sumerian, and the Babylonians reinterpreted it in their own language. And Hebrew reinterprets it too, in the opposite direction. Genesis connects Babel to the verb balal, to mix, to confuse. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth. Two folk etymologies for the same name, from two cultures, pointing exactly opposite ways. Gate of God, confusion. Neither is what the name originally meant. Both tell you precisely what the people using them thought about the place. And here is a piece of context that gives the chapter a depth most readings miss. The plain of Shinar, where Genesis sets the confusion of language, is the plain where language was first written down. The city of Uruk, Erech in the 10th chapter of Genesis, has produced the earliest known writing in the world. In the Iana precinct there, in levels dated to roughly 3,300 to 3,000 years before Christ, excavators found clay tablets covered in what is now called proto-cuneiform. Hundreds of pictographic and abstract signs, impressed with a reed stylus, arranged in ruled boxes. They are not literature. They are accounts. Allocations of barley, rations of beer, quantities of textiles, counts of sheep. The oldest writing in the world is a receipt. The American scholar Denise Schment-Besserat proposed, in a body of work running from the 1970s onward, that writing grew out of an older accounting practice, small clay tokens of various shapes, used across the Near East for thousands of years to stand for quantities of goods, sometimes sealed inside hollow clay balls with the shapes impressed on the outside, so the contents could be checked without breaking the container. And then, at some point, somebody realized that if the marks on the outside told you what was inside, you did not need what was inside. The ball was flattened into a tablet. 3 dimensions became 2. That, on her account, is the invention of writing. Her model has been debated in its details. Not every sign can be traced to a token, and institutional bookkeeping, seal practice, and scribal training all played their part. The broad line from counting to writing is widely accepted, and it means the first script on Earth emerged from the need to keep track of grain. Something like 5,000 proto-cuneiform tablets and fragments are known, mostly from Uruk. A very large number of their signs still cannot be read. So on that plane, in a few centuries, human beings learned to fix speech in clay, and within 1,000 years, the same script was carrying law codes, hymns, medical texts, astronomical observations, letters home, and the story of a man who survived a flood. And Genesis sets on that same plane the moment when human beings stopped being able to understand one another. I am not going to make an argument out of that. It is not an argument. It is a juxtaposition, and I offer it because it is the sort of thing that gives a familiar chapter its true depth. The place where writing began is the place the Bible remembers as the place language broke. Both of those are about the same problem, from opposite ends. How do you make what is in one mind arrive intact in another? So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. They left off to build the city. That is the last event in the primeval history, And it is not a catastrophe. Nobody dies. The tower is not destroyed. The text never says it was. Work simply stops, and the people disperse, and the site is left, which, incidentally, is what actually happened to Etemenanki more than once. Ziggurats were repeatedly abandoned, half-built, and repeatedly restored by later kings who boasted about finishing what their predecessors had left. Koldewey found the ziggurat at Eridu unfinished too, in the 3rd dynasty of levels. An abandoned tower with the scaffolding gone and the brick stack still standing beside it was not a strange sight on that plain. It was a normal one. And here is a thought I want to leave with you before we come down toward the end, offered as my own and not as the field's. Every reading of Babel I was given as a child treated the scattering purely as punishment. And it is a judgment, plainly. The text says the Lord did there confound the language. But look at what the builders themselves said they were afraid of. Lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. And look at what God said to Noah in the 9th chapter, and to the first human beings in the 1st chapter. Be fruitful, and multiply, and replenish the earth. Fill the earth. Spread out. Go. The builders' stated purpose was to prevent exactly the thing they had been told to do. They wanted one city, one name, one place, forever. What they got was the world. I hold that lightly, as I have held the others. It is a reading, and readers I respect hear the chapter as pure judgment and nothing else, and they may be right. But I have never been able to hear the scattering as only a loss, and I wanted to say so. And then the book does the last thing you would expect. After the tower, it gives you another list. These are the generations of Shem. Shem was 100 years old, and begat Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. 10 more names, from Shem down to Terah, in exactly the format of the 5th chapter. He lived so many years and begat, and he lived so many years after, and he begat sons and daughters. Except that something is different, and it is easy to miss on a first reading. The ages are coming down. Shem lives 600 years, Arphaxad 438. Down through Salah, Eber, Peleg, Reu, Serug, Nahor, and the numbers slide 239, 230, 148, until we reach Terah at 205. And a few chapters later, Abraham will die at 175, and Joseph at 110, and Moses at 120. And after that, we are simply among people who die at the ages people die at. The world is settling back down to its ordinary size. I said earlier that the Sumerian King List does the same thing, and it is worth restating now that we have both lists in front of us. Enormous reigns before the flood, shorter reigns after, and eventually the numbers arrive at lengths that a modern historian can check against dated events. 2 traditions, from the same corner of the world, both of them describing a diminishment across the same boundary. There is one more honesty I owe you about these numbers, and it concerns the manuscripts. The figures in the genealogies of Genesis 5 and 11 are not the same in every ancient version of the Bible. The Hebrew Masoretic text, the Greek Septuagint, and the Samaritan Pentateuch each give different sets, and the differences are systematic rather than random. The Septuagint tends to add 100 years to the age at which several patriarchs father their sons. The result is that the total time from Adam to Abraham comes out very differently depending on which text you count from, a difference of well over 1,000 years. This is not a controversial claim. It is visible in the manuscripts and has been discussed since antiquity. The early church fathers who used the Greek text worked with one chronology, and Jerome, going back to the Hebrew, worked with another. I mention it because if you have ever tried to add up the years of the Bible and arrive at a date, you have run into this, and it is better to know that the divergence is in the manuscript tradition itself than to conclude you have made an arithmetic mistake. And now, the last 3 verses of the 11th chapter, which are the hinge of the entire book. And Terah took Abram his son, and Lot, the son of Haran, his son's son, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth with them from Ur of the Chaldees, to go into the land of Canaan, and they came unto Haran, and dwelt there. Ur of the Chaldees. We know that city extremely well, because it is the same Ur where Leonard Woolley dug his pit, and it is one of the most thoroughly excavated sites in Mesopotamia. In the early 2nd millennium before Christ, Ur was a great, crowded, prosperous port city near the head of the Persian Gulf, which then lay closer than it does now. Its patron deity was Nana, the moon god, called Sin in Akkadian, and the city's great ziggurat, built by Ur-Nammu around 2100 before Christ, and still standing in part today, was his. Woolley's excavations in the 1920s and 30s uncovered not only the royal cemetery, with its gold and lapis and its terrible evidence of retainers buried with their masters, but something less famous and, to my eye, more affecting: ordinary streets. Whole blocks of private houses from around 1800 before Christ. 2 stories, built around a small central courtyard with a staircase and rooms opening off a gallery. Narrow winding lanes between them. Drains. A small domestic chapel in some of the houses, with the family's dead buried under the floor. Woolley gave the excavated lanes street names, in the English manner. Old Street, Paternoster Row, Straight Street. You can still see them on the plans. Somebody's front door, a staircase worn on one side, a room where the family kept its dead close enough to speak to. That is the city Terah's family left. And they went as far as Haran, which is not a coincidence either. And this is one of my favorite small details in the whole of Genesis. Haran, the city in northern Mesopotamia, in what is now southeastern Turkey, was the other great center of the moon god's worship in the ancient Near East. It kept that reputation for 2,000 years. The Temple of Sin at Haran was still there in the 6th century before Christ, when the last Babylonian king Nabonidus rebuilt it and installed his mother's cult there. Ur and Haran, 2 moon god cities at opposite ends of Mesopotamia, on the great trade road that connected them. A family from the southern one packs up and travels the whole length of that road to the northern one, and stops there and lives there. Terah dies there. Whatever else that journey is, it is a completely plausible ancient itinerary. It is the route a merchant family would take between the 2 cities where their people's god was worshipped. And the primeval history ends with a family in a house in Haran, and an old man's death, and a younger man about to be told to keep going west, which is where the story of the Bible, as most people know it, begins, and where tonight we stop. So let us come back. The prism is in a case in Oxford now, under low lighting, because clay of that age does not like the sun. 8 inches of baked mud, 4 sides, 2 columns of writing on each, and a hole bored through the middle from top to bottom. It was made a little under 4,000 years ago, most likely in the reign of a king of Isin named Sin-Magir, in the 18th century before Christ. It is not the only copy. Something like 20 manuscripts of the King List are known, from Nippur and Isin and Kish and Larsa and Susa, but it is the fullest. It is a copy. That is the thing to hold on to. Somebody sat down with an older text in front of him and made another one, because the older one was wearing out, or was needed elsewhere, or because a teacher told him to. And the hole through the middle means somebody expected it to be handled, not sealed in a foundation deposit, not buried under a doorway as a charm, turned on a pin by a hand so the next column came round. I keep thinking about that hand. It belonged to somebody who lived in a country where the water came, and who had been taught a list of names of people who lived before the water came, and who turned the prism to read them. And about 400 miles west, or 1,000 years later, or both, somebody else was doing precisely the same thing with a different list, Adam, Seth, Enos, Canaan, Mahalaleel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, Noah. Same instinct, same country, same insistence on getting the names down and keeping them. Every civilization on that plain believed that the world had ended once, and every one of them responded to that belief in the same way, by writing down who had been here, and by making sure the writing outlived them. Berosus said the hero buried the books at Sippar before the water came. Josephus said the sons of Seth cut their knowledge into two pillars, one of brick and one of stone, so that one of them would survive whichever way the world ended. Neither of those is a matter of record. Both of them are true about something, because the tablets did survive, not because anybody buried them cleverly, but because a palace burned in Nineveh in 612 before Christ and baked the library hard, and because clay is the most patient material human beings have ever written on. Paper rots, parchment is eaten, papyrus crumbles unless the ground is bone dry, mud lasts. And so we have the list, and the flood tablet, and the round boat with its rope quantities, and the Sumerian tablet from Nippur that Arno Poebel read in 1914 with 2/3 of it missing, and the accounts of barley from Uruk that nobody can fully read yet. And we have the 11 chapters, which came down a different way, hand to hand, copy to copy, synagogue to monastery to printing house, and then out to a country nobody in Shinar had heard of, and then into your house, and onto a shelf, and possibly onto the table beside you right now. I said at the beginning that we would set 3 things beside each other and let them stand. So here they are, at the end of the night, laid out plainly and without a verdict. The text says that God made the world and called it good, that something went wrong in it early, that the wrong grew until it grieved him, that he preserved one household through water, and that he promised afterward never to do it again, and hung up his bow to say so. The ground shows a floodplain in southern Iraq, where cities were built out of mud and repeatedly destroyed by water, where the oldest temple sequence on earth stands 18 floors deep under a mound at Eridu, where writing was invented to count barley, and where at least 4 separate flood narratives were written down before Genesis reached the form we have. And the tradition holds, Jewish and Christian, for well over 2,000 years, that these 11 chapters are true in the way that matters most, and it is held that while disagreeing internally, sometimes sharply, about almost every question of how, Origen and Basil and Augustine did not agree about the days. The rabbis did not agree about the numbers. The fathers did not agree about the sons of God, and all of them stayed in the same house. I find that a very restful thought to end on, and I offer it to you as one. You are allowed to not know. You have been allowed to not know for 1,800 years, and the people who did not know were not standing at the back of the church. They were writing it. There is one image I want to leave you with, and then I am going to be quiet. It is not the flood. The flood is the loud part of these chapters, and it is not, I think, what they are finally about. It is what comes after the flood, when the ground has dried and the door has opened, and there is nothing left of the old world at all. And the first thing that happens is a promise about the calendar. While the earth remaineth, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. Not a promise that nothing will go wrong. The chapter has just finished saying that human beings have not improved and will not. A promise, instead, that the ordinary turning will continue, that there will be a planting season, and then a harvest, and a cold spell, and then a warm one, and a night, and then a morning, and then another night, and then another morning, going on and on past everyone who is currently worrying about it. That is what a farmer on a floodplain wanted more than anything in the world. Not exemption, continuation. And the sign of it is a weapon hung up in the sky where anybody can see it, curved the wrong way to be fired. So, The prism turns on its pin, and the columns come round one after another, and the names go past, Alulim, Alongar, and the rest, and then the flood, and then the ordinary kings, and then whoever was reading. And the other list turns too, Adam, Seth, Enos, and down through all of them, and then the water, and then Shem, and then a family walking north out of Ur with everything they own on donkeys along the road toward Haran. The last thing the primeval history does is not end the world. It walks a family out of a city and puts them on a road. That is the homecoming, not a twist, just the place the long list was always going. It is very late now, and I have kept you a long time in a country of mud brick and clay tablets and rivers behaving badly. Let me put the lamp out slowly. The plain is dark. The rivers are where they have always been. Somewhere under the sand, there is a mound with 18 floors in it, and under Oxford glass there is a clay prism with a hole through its middle. And in a case in London, there is a small tablet the size of your hand that tells a man how much rope to buy. They are all still there. Nobody has to turn them tonight. The barley is in the ground. The seasons are doing what they were promised to do. Seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, and day and night. The night is the part we are in. It is not the last part. Sleep well. The morning is already on its way, exactly as it was told to be.